Yeah.
And then periodically Nadine Jelsing, who's filming it and producing it, will email me or call me and ask me a couple of questions and then go off again, and I don't hear from her for months.
So it's kind of your way of promoting the Oregon wine industry a little bit?
Sort of. I mean, it's an ERAF foundation. I'm the one who did all the negotiations. It was my idea.
Yeah.
Because they did a beer Vana, why can't they do an Oregon wine one?
Yeah.
It's got as much impact on the economy. So I pitched, Steve Bass, who runs OPB, is a personal friend. So I pitched him and pitched him and pitched him, and then he finally agreed to a meeting, and they all got enthusiastic about it and wanted to do it.
Oh, that's great.
And then we gave them some money, not tied to, we gave them money for their general fund because we didn't want any conflict of interest, because if they interviewed Dick Erath or something, we didn't want it to look like Dick was paying for his own interview or something.
Oh,
like
right, yeah.
So we just gave it to the general fund, and they'll pull money out as they need it.
Yeah, that's it. And we're kind of in the same boat. You know, we've had winemakers say, how can we help, and that sort of thing. And, you know, and I think some folks have kind of donated wine for like a fundraiser auction type thing.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, we're definitely.
You've got to be careful about
Yeah.
who you take from, and if you're going to use them on camera, it gets to be, it could be questioned.
Yeah, and especially for an institution like OPB, you know, which represents the whole state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful. So we
Yeah.
just gave to the general fund, not to produce something in particular, just to support OPB, which we've been doing anyway.
Yeah.
We've given them monies in the past because we like what they do, and they do educational things to the public. So we just did more of that, and then they're producing this Oregon History Show, and they're gonna, at one point they said they may even do other chapters to it.
Oh, that'd
The
be-
first one, they'll see how it goes, and they may do other ones as well, and they want to do radio programs off of it, and they want to do, you know, web things off of it, so it's gonna have some mileage, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and that's, you know, great for you, because the more dynamic the industry becomes, the more interesting your world becomes too.
Yes, that's true, but the institutions have largely ignored Oregon. You know, the governor has sort of ignored it, and the OPB has ignored it, and I think it's time they started paying attention to.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think they look at it as hobby.
Yeah.
I don't think they look at it as a firm economic base that is giving back to the state, although the recent economic study may be changing people's minds, I don't know. But one interesting thing out of that economic study, something that really I didn't expect, only 30% of Oregon wine is sold in state.
Wow. And you know, the assumption that we all have is that, you know, local and Portland is the big market.
Exactly, but it's not. 30%, that's all. And there's great room for the winemakers to milk more out of the local markets.
Yeah.
If they can figure out how to do that.
Well, let me ask you. Well, since we're here looking at an urban winery, what have you noticed about the urban wine scene and the urban winery scene?
It's grown. I think there are people who really wanted to make wine, didn't want to move out to wine country, wanted to source their grapes from there, but have work be closer to where they lived. And it's really mushroomed out over the last, I'd say, 5 years. Bodecker originally was based in the Willamette Valley, and they, commuted back and forth, and I think they got tired of it. So they started this with John Groschow, who also made his wine somewhere else in the valley, and came up with the idea of starting something here. And I just think it's a brilliant idea. And it gives people a place to sample wine without having to schlep down to the valley.
What does that mean for Portland too?
It just gives Portlanders an opportunity to sample wine in Portland Does it add to the economic value of Portland? Only in as much as they can get their wine into varying venues in Portland, into restaurants or wine shops. And I can't speak to that because I don't know what their individual plans are of how they're planning to attack that. But I think it's good for Portland.
And so, what about your background? How did you find your way
Into the wine world?
Yeah.
Sort of different ways. In 1990, I was appointed the restaurant columnist and critic for the Oregonian. And about 3 years into that, I was bored. How many ways can you write about chicken? You know, it gets old after a while. And I realized that wine had much more intellectual content. And I was much more interested in wine. So I started writing about wine, and what I really started writing about was Oregon wine. Nobody had stepped up to the plate to write about Oregon before. I was sort of the first person to do that. And I would infuse in my columns wine dinners and visiting wine country and wine lists. And every now and again I'd get my hand slapped, you write about restaurants. And I'd go back to writing about restaurants and slowly infuse more and more about wine and wine country and wine lists. And I get my hand slapped again. You know, it was a cycle. And by 1997, I was admitted into the Master of Wine program. And that was also the year Jancis Robinson started paying attention to me. Do you know who Jancis Robinson is?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Jancis Robinson asked me if I would write the Oregon and Washington chapters for her World Atlas her Oxford Companion to Wine. And I've done 2 editions of that so far and work on the World Atlas of Wine.
How do you think she took notice of the work that you were doing?
Well, partly it was my doing. In 1997, my husband and I were in London, and he took me to Victoria Station. I was going to Bordeaux for Vin Expo, and he took me to Victoria Station where they have the express to Gatwick. And she was the only other person in the Victoria Express office going also to Vin Expo. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and I said, "You probably don't remember meeting me in Portland. You did. But I write about wine, and I've been accepted into the Master of Wine program. And it's a pleasure to see you again." And she said, "Oh, well, let's sit together on the airplane." And we did. And she was editing her autobiography then. I think in the US it was called Tasting Pleasures. And she gave me chapters to edit. And she liked how I edited it. And so she would find me during Vin Expo and say, "Let's go tasting together." And, you know, Jancis is such a public figure that by the time we were, tasted at 2 different places, there was a crowd of people attached to us that we took with us wherever we went. I met a lot of people that way. And then when she got home, she emailed me, "Would you like to do Oregon and Washington?" So she sort of adopted me, and it was a big launch to my career. By that time, in 96, I started doing the Hugh Johnson Pocket Guide, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, because Judy Peterson Nedry had been doing it. She had, alcohol issues she had to deal with, so she couldn't do that anymore. And it was given to me. So I was doing that, and I think Jancis knew I was doing that.
So you talked about this intellectual attraction. What is it about wine that makes it so fascinating in that way?
You never know everything about wine. Wine is forever, there are unexplained elements in wine. It's intellectual because you have to know a little biochemistry. You have to know a little bit about spoilage. You have to know a little bit about all kinds of funny little intellectual academic areas to be really proficient in wine, and that fascinated me. There's a why to wine. There's a how to wine. Wine doesn't magically go from grape to bottle. There are processes involved, and those are all pretty intellectual processes. If you think about it, if you think about the conversion of sugars and yeast into alcohol and what could go wrong, that's pretty complicated. You can get lucky and make wine and not have problems, but you're much better equipped if you understand what could happen and couldn't happen. And it was fascinating to me because even though you understand major parts of it, you can never wrap yourself around all the many different parts of wine. It's too enormous a subject. And that keeps me going. You know, you think you're grabbing onto it and you can't quite reach it because and weather changes. You know, there's climate change, there are regional differences in different places, and that all has impact on wine. So there are so many factors that have impact on wine, from your soil to slope to what man does, what winemakers' decisions are, how much time in oak, how much time in stainless steel, how much amount of oak to use, and all of those kinds of questions. There's so much influence that it's fascinating.
And a lot of folks who have that level of fascination that you have kind of do what the Bodeckers have done, or we've interviewed so many people. So, and you've kind of remained your writer, and you've stayed on the writing track. So have you ever been tempted?
I have no desire to make wine. I don't want the worry. I don't want the fear. And I don't want to have to sell it. I'm happy writing about it, believe me. That's a very good place for me to be, because that also becomes an intellectual exercise. When you're writing about it, you have to write in a very coherent way so other people can understand you. So that's perfectly fine for me. I don't need to get my hands dirty, as it were.
So as you've been watching this from the early 90s.
Yeah, 93 is when I first started writing about wine.
What changes have you seen in the Oregon wine industry?
Loads and loads of changes. First of all, the number of wineries, the number of vineyards has more than tripled since that time. I mean, it's been an amazing growth, huge growth. When I wrote a book in 2001, there were only about 150 wineries. Now there are 450. I mean, the growth has been exponential. The decisions winemakers make. In 93, they were only starting to plant grafted vines. You know, everyone in the early days had planted self-rooted vines. Well, grafted vines make a big difference for phylloxera, and we have phylloxera here, quite a bit of it. So in 93, or the early 90s, they started planting more grafted, and I think anyone who plants self-grafted vines now is stupid with the availability of rootstock and scion, and the ability to plant a disease-resistant program.
Do you ever detect differences between own-rooted vines and grafted vines?
Allegedly, people say, and I'm not convinced of it, that self-rooted vines produce a better wine. I've tasted bad wines that are on self-rooted vines, and I've tasted great wines on grafted vines. Burgundy is entirely grafted. You're going to tell me there aren't great wines coming out of Burgundy? The two places where there isn't phylloxera are Washington State, because the soil is so sandy, the louse can't, be very mobile through the sand. It's nothing to grip onto. And the same with Argentina. Argentina is also self-rooted because they don't have a problem with phylloxera. But are the wines of Washington better quality than Bordeaux or than Coonawarra or Western Australia? No. There are individual wines that are, certainly, but no region stands heads and shoulders above another region because they have self-rooted vines. There are old vines that are both grafted and ungrafted vines, and older vines produce better wine. It doesn't, in my opinion, make a huge difference whether the root is grafted or ungrafted.
What are some of the other changes that have happened? There's this explosion.
Clones have changed. In '85, David Adelsheim went to Colmar and Burgundy to forge agreements to get the proper clones, because there had been question about Pinot Blanc. In California, most Pinot Blanc was Melon de Bourgogne, not true Alsatian Pinot Blanc. Here, we've been pretty clean with Pinot Blanc. But he went to get clones, not only the proper clones from Alsace, but also to get what are the so-called Dijon clones from Burgundy, to add complexity to the Wädenswil and Pommard we already had growing. People who planted from 1990 and before were mostly Wädenswil and Pommard. Now, post-1990, when they needed to replant, they did extra plantings as well in the so-called Dijon clones. The Dijon clones ripen earlier as well, and that was an advantage to us because the rains come in so much during the fall. We can get early rain.
Have you seen a change in the quality of the wines then?
Yes.
In the past?
Like anything else, the more you do something, you get better at it. So these winemakers, you see a constant improvement over time. And I'd like to think that the best wines from these guys haven't been made because the quality will keep going up. The more comfortable they are with the processes, the more they know their vineyards and where they get their fruit better, the more comfortable they are with a hands-off approach and being comfortable letting the wine do what the wine wants to do. That all takes time, and you'll get an exponential quality difference.
Do you think, with our region, basically it's been one and a half generations since folks have been making wine here, and you go to France, where people have been doing it for 20 generations.
Of course.
And a lot of folks say this is the Burgundy of America. Is it fair to compare Oregon to Burgundy?
No, not whatsoever. We have different soil, we have different exposures, we have different influences. You're never going to duplicate another region's wines in a totally different region. We are fruitier than Burgundy. We are New World, not Old World. And we don't, to even think you're going to approach a wine of Burgundy. No, you can say, have we approached Burgundy in terms of quality? You can say that because the quality of our wines keeps getting better, and I think right now we've got pretty good quality across the board. Oh, there are a handful of producers who maybe aren't at the same level that most producers are, but I think most producers know what they're doing and have had enough experience now to know what they're doing. And the new kids always have worked for somebody else and gotten experience working for, doing the legwork and the grunt work for someone else, so they too have had experience making wine.
Now, a lot of folks are starting off lives, and some of them have this moment where they've always been wine lovers, and then they decide to get into the wine industry. And some of them succeed, and some of them struggle and fail. What kind of odds are they up against?
Huge odds. First of all, in Oregon, who's going to drink all this wine? The more winemakers we have, the more vineyards we have, the more wine that's in production. Who's going to drink it all? The economic report said that only 30% of the wine produced in this state is drunk in this state. So who's going to drink all this wine that's being made? That's a real concern. The more people that come and make wine, the bigger that issue becomes.
What other kind of struggles will they face? Because some people go in and it's sort of a second career, or they have some.
Correct. A lot of people have done that, but most of them have, in the second career category, hire winemakers and hire experienced winemakers. So that helps them with quality. They don't have to bumble along. That helps them with quality. But again, I really worry that we are proliferating to a rate of, there's going to be a lot of inventory hanging around a lot of wineries. I think wineries have to have wine clubs. They have to have an online sales opportunity. And maybe, yes, distribution. I don't think distribution does wonders anymore, But I think being in distribution gives you a somewhat better chance of getting your wines out there. But they have to have a wine club, and you have to have an online presence for people to order your wine.
Do you see some people kind of getting into the industry and not knowing what they're in for, or have you...
Fewer and fewer of those people. I think, again, most of the people who have started wineries in the last, let's say, 5 years have worked for someone else, and they've seen the problems that somebody else has had, and they will understand them enough to change how they do things when they're on their own. I don't think most people wind up in a bad situation, but I do wonder who's going to buy it all. Who's going to buy all the wine?
Do you see any other sort of problem signs in kind of the
Yes.
way that Oregon is approaching, or some winemakers in Oregon are approaching?
Well, last year we didn't harvest something like 25% or 20%, a big number of our fruit. Part of that was from animals, deer coming in, or birds especially, because it was such a late harvest. But also, fruit hung on the vine. It wasn't picked, or if it was picked, it was fermented and not done anything with. Nothing was, it wasn't bottled. I think we're in a slightly overproduction phase, and that has me a little worried.
What kind of impact might that have on...
It's just going to mean that we've planted too much, and it's not worth harvesting, or it's not worth making into wine, because that costs money too, and you cut your losses at a certain point. The other problem that we face here in Oregon is people price their Pinots pretty high. It's hard to find a Pinot for $25. There are some. Groshout sells some. Bodeckers, I think, are more, 30 to 40. Those are expensive wines. The growth in the industry right now is between $15 and $25 a bottle. And when people are pricing their Pinots at $60, $75, $85, $100 a bottle, that's pricey, and you're going to see less of that bought, where someone with a $25 bottle may buy a case of wine. I don't think someone at $100 a bottle is going to buy a case of wine.
Why do you think folks are pricing in that range? Or?
Because they think they can get it. It's as simple as that. They don't want to undersell. They don't want to leave money on the table. And if they think that, and they are selling 2 or 3 bottles at a time at that kind of pricing, and maybe they think that's good enough. If they can do enough of that, if they can get hundreds of people to buy 2 or 3 bottles, then that's good for them.
It seems like prices have gone up quite a bit in the past 10 years even.
Yep.
What are
Yep.
some of the factors in that sort of?
I'm not quite sure. You're keeping up with the Joneses. He prices his wine at $100 a bottle. I can do that too. I don't think that it's a factor of anything. I think that it's competition, and his wine's as good as my wine. His wine sells for X dollars. I'm going to make mine X dollars.
How does that, in terms of selling wine in other markets and other regions?
It makes it hard because you're competing against very good, not necessarily Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is an expensive grape to make because it always has to be low yielding. You have to do a fair amount of vineyard work to get the right amount of fruit exposure. It's a difficult grape to make. And they think that for that amount of work that you have to do and that low a yield on crop, you should be well compensated. I'm not sure what the cutoff line is, but it's expensive, and it's a little too expensive. You can see Chilean Pinot Noir at $12 a bottle. You can see some Australian, but not much Australian. But Chilean is done very well. Chilean Pinot Noir is done very well in the U.S. in restaurants for glass pours because it's well priced. The quality is okay. It's not brilliant. Oregon also sees itself as a very high quality production, and so the pricing is consistent with that.
What Pinot Noir really does command a lot of, certainly in the valley, Willamette Valley, a lot of attention, but there was sort of that sideways effect and sort of this...
Sideways did enormous positive to Oregon. It helped boost, after that slight recession in 01, 02, it helped pick Oregon up and get reasonable sales. It was a wonderful thing that happened to Oregon.
So really just that one film had a huge impact on the industry.
It really, really did. Amazingly. It wasn't cool to drink Merlot, it was cool to drink Pinot Noir.
And so the Pinot Noir has this kind of almost a cult following.
The cognoscente, wine writers tend to like Pinot Noir, like higher acid, cool climate grapes, wines. And so I think that Pinot Noir is viewed as a cool grape to like.
What, thinking about your experiences in wine, did you, was there a sort of a time that you first became aware of wine, or a certain experience or a bottle that really turned your head?
Not one bottle, really. Well, I, like everyone else, started with Bordeaux in my early 20s and really came to love Bordeaux and understand what Bordeaux was. But I was soon outpriced by Bordeaux. Who can afford, at that point, it was maybe $15 a bottle. Who could afford always drinking $15 bottles? This was a while ago. $15 had a different representation. But I remember moving first to Rioja and then to Nebbiolo d'Alba. And to this day, I'm a huge Barolo drinker. I love Barolo, aged Barolo, which is very similar to Pinot Noir in its vineyard designation, its cool climate. So the people who like Pinot Noir usually do like Nebbiolo.
In that sort of that history of the Bordeaux and to Nebbiolo, to the Italian wines, is there anything in that spectrum, a sort of a wine that particularly took your attention, or a moment or a situation?
It was a Bordeaux that really took my attention first. It was a Chateau Figeac. Figeac is a right bank property, so Saint-Emilion, but it's the only Saint-Emilion that has a higher percentage of Cabernet rather than using Merlot as its primary grape, which is why I like it. I really don't like Merlot. Movie aside, I'm not a big Merlot fan, but it has a higher percentage of Cabernet. And I think that was the first wine, a sophisticated wine, that I really fell in love with. And then, of course, I discovered Riesling and I discovered Pinot Noir, and I worked my way through the other varieties. And to this day, my cellar is mostly Riesling, Barolo and Barbaresco, and Burgundy.
And then that first Bordeaux, did somebody introduce that to you?
Yes, I had a boyfriend when I was in my early 20s who was much older than I was, and he was taking wine classes, and together we bought a case of Chateau Figeac. And we saw what happened to it over time. We would drink a bottle or two a year, and we would see its evolution, and that really taught me that wine, if you save wine, it was more interesting than when you bought it. That was a very good lesson for me.
So that's sort of that part of that intellectual quality.
Exactly.
Wine
And nobody to this day knows how and why wine ages. I mean, we know what happens. We know the tannins polymerize, but we don't understand the other characteristics. Not enough research has been done to understand when a wine ages, what happens. What is the oxygen transfer that's happening in the bottle? We don't know.
When in your time of covering wine, what are some of the more surprising moments or striking conversations you had? Is there anything that stands out that caught you off guard, or
I don't know about caught me off guard. Remember, during most of this time, I've also been a Master of Wine student. So that's really studying and understanding, and there's very little that will catch you off guard. But I can remember, certain aha moments, understanding the relationship of vineyard to wine in the bottle. I travel extensively, and visiting a wine region is really a way to fully understand the wine, where the wine came from, how the wine evolved from vineyard to bottle, and what the geography is, how was the grape grown, and that to me is invaluable. I started traveling in the late 90s, and having that among my experiences has really been invaluable to me.
During those travels, did you run into any colorful characters?
Oh, there are lots of colorful characters in wine. Not all of them are still alive today, but I can remember chasing Didier Dagenot, who is now dead, is a Sancerre producer who used some barrels in making his Sancerre, and it's not something I particularly like, but I was immensely curious on why he chose to do that. So I remember he was here in Portland, and there was a tasting of his, and I followed him from the tasting to the wine shops he was going in order to continue my conversations with him. And he looked like a wild man. He had long hair, he dressed in flannel shirts and jeans, and I chased him all over town. I also chased Nicolas Joly around. Nicolas Joly is the Grand Duke of biodynamics. He's the, not Grand Duke, he's the chief acolyte at Steiner's feet. And I remember chasing him around Portland when he was here from a seminar to wine shops he went to afterwards, bothering him with questions about why his Savignier, which is from the Loire, Chenin Blanc from the Loire, was colored the way it was or tasted the way it did. Those are both colorful characters.
In the biodynamic side of things, that's getting a lot more popular. It's almost becoming a mainstream thing. Do you think that there's something there? Some folks are skeptical about it and dismissive.
I am somewhat skeptical about it because a lot of it does not have basis in science. And I'm sort of a science kind of girl. But anything that makes you pay more attention to your vineyard is a good thing. And so biodynamics really forces you to go out and look at your vineyard and really assess what's going on in your vineyard. And if it takes biodynamics to get a producer to be more in his vineyard, great. I don't care what the vehicle is. I don't believe in all aspects of biodynamics. I'm not going to drink only biodynamic wine. I think great wines can be made from many places in many different ways. But if that gets somebody out into the vineyard more, I think that's terrific.
Now, there are some other regions that are starting to produce wines, certainly the Okanagan. Now, places like Arizona, where Dick Erath has a concern going. Are any of those regions taking your attention? Are you aware of those?
They're taking attention. I haven't been bowled over by quality. To be honest with you, I tend to drink more European wine than I do New World wine because I like minerality. I like the taste of earth and minerality, and you don't get that very much with New World wines. And so that's why I drink more European wines.
Let's see, we talked about Oregon wines. Is there anything that defines the character of Oregon winemaking that makes the region distinct? Or
I don't think so, because there are so many different styles made in this state. You have people, let me just talk Pinot Noir, which is 70% of the wine grown in Oregon. There are people who use stems in wine production. There are people who totally de-stem it. There are people who use more new oak. There are people who use less new oak. There are people who make it from lower elevations, there are people who make it from higher elevations. Style is all across the map. There is no Oregon style. The character of Oregon fruit, it's hard to say because, first of all, in the Willamette Valley, there's so many different soil types, so many different elevations, sedimentary soil, volcanic soil, and that's elevation based. You can't call anything Oregon style. Now you can call Oregon Pinot Gris an interesting style of its own because it is halfway between Alsatian Pinot Gris and Italian Pinot Grigio. It's that fleshy, round mouthfeel, but with very high acidity. Normally Pinot Gris in Alsace is very fleshy, but with lower acidity. And Pinot Grigio in Italy is high acid, but not much mouthfeel. It's a merger of the two. And that is very much an Oregon style. But for other varieties, I don't see it. I could not identify. Yes, maybe I can. Whoops. That scared me.
Yeah.
Scared me too.
Let's see.
Oregon Pinot Noir has a style of bright fruit, of good acid-supported bright fruit, different from California Pinot Noir. Different from California Pinot Noir, where the fruit is a flatter style. There may be acid, but the fruit itself is flat. Oregon is brighter, lifted fruit. Similar to Central Otago in New Zealand, with that ripeness, but with that big lift. And I think that's an Oregon style, but it also might be a Central Otago style, that there isn't a unique Oregon style for Pinot Noir.
What about just in New World wines? There are some differences, and you talk about your drinking a lot of European wines. And again, in Europe, kind of winemaking is almost a birthright handed down by generations, and land is hard to come by and expensive and that sort of thing. But we have so many people, and we have like wine regions here in the Willamette Valley, which folks decided we're going to make this a premium wine region, and folks are now trying to do the same thing in Arizona or parts of Colorado.
In all 50 states, there is wine production.
What do you think drives folks to do that?
A pride in where they live and a passion for making wine. I think David Lett came up here. He wasn't really the first. Richard Summers and Chuck Corey were here before he planted, not Pinot Noir, but other varieties before David planted his Pinot Noir. And I think they came to cooler climate other than California. California was looked at as the mothership, and they didn't want to grow grapes in California. They came up here because it was cooler climate, and they wanted to produce cooler climate wines. I think the growth of wine in different states across the U.S. is a function of, I have a passion for wine, I live here, I'll try to do it here. I don't think it's much more than that. I think that they look around and see they have hillsides they can plant on, or they can see potentially good vineyard land somewhere else, and they take advantage of that. I don't think it's more thought than that. There is an organization headed by Dave McIntyre, who's the wine writer for the Washington Post, and Jeff Siegel, who lives in Dallas, and I'm not sure what Jeff does, but it's called Drink Local Wine, and they have festivals each spring in different parts of the U.S. They've been in Missouri, they've been in Virginia, they've been in Texas, they go to Colorado next year, and they celebrate the wines in each of the states. Do I want to what
What do you think is the role of wine writers in this whole process?
Okay. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not a consumer writer. I'm a trade writer. I write for the leading trade publication. So I have to look, when I write something, I have to look at a winemaker, a grape grower, a distributor, or a retailer being interested in what I write, not a consumer being interested. A consumer writer tries to guide people to drinking wine that the writer likes. I remember until recently, until the last 5 years, Riesling was not a big selling item. Now it's one of the fastest growing items. But every wine writer consumer writer pushed Riesling. And the sales stats didn't change until about 5 years ago when it started to go up. Is that cumulative attack? People finally got what wine writers for 20 years have been saying? I don't know. Or have the Riesling producers done a better job of educating the public? I don't know. But I think a consumer wine writer is there to help guide people to choose wines that the wine writer likes. I mean, it's the only way to look at it. And for me, I write about issues and trends and developments in the industry, again, from the trade perspective of what trade would be interested in. So very different. I don't write about individual wines. So there are two kinds of writers, basically. And to be honest with you, I like not writing for consumers. I don't have to define malolactic fermentation when I write. And I certainly don't have to sell one wine or another. And a lot of writers do. In that, I'm writing things that would be of interest to the trade. Is it a resource? Yeah, but it's also trying to be ahead of the curve sometimes and to write about things that a winemaker or a grape grower didn't know he needed to know about, but you're trying to introduce it to them.
There seems to be a certain level of, whether it's true or not, of a glamour in the wine writer role, because as we travel around, we see an increasing number, thousands of people now writing about wine.
Well, bloggers,
yeah,
yes.
Bloggers, and
anyone with an interest in wine now sets up a page on the computer and blogs about it. My problem with that is there is no vetting. At least with the publication vets its staff and decides whether the people know anything writing about wine. There is none of that with bloggers. And so you have bloggers who don't know what they're writing about, don't know enough about wine, but like wine. And that's a little problematic. I think it's great that more and more people are taking an interest in wine. I think that's terrific. And I think it's great people are expressing opinions about wine. I think that's terrific. I don't even know how you would regulate that. I mean, should there be some exam that all wine writers or bloggers take to make sure they know what they're talking about in order to write? I don't know.
Do you see that sort of changes in communication having an impact on the industry or on your industry at all?
Yeah, you do. I think bloggers now have a more important role because they are recognized by festivals and organizations and by PR people who want to get promotion and visibility to their clients. And bloggers are invited to wineries as guests to learn more about their winery, or bloggers are invited to festivals to participate in the festivals because they want more pages on the internet that people might or might not read about the wines and the festivals. So they're getting a little more credibility, and some bloggers have more credibility than other bloggers.
Yeah, we've interviewed some of the people, and also like the guys from Grape Radio, who are extremely knowledgeable, successful business people, but have such a passion about wine that they need to do something to get more connected with it. But sort of like you, they don't want the worry of having a vineyard and going through all the processes and enjoy and being on the sidelines. So
Exactly.
it seems to be some changes in how wine is covered and how people engage with wine.
Yeah, I think the internet has had a lot to do with that. Again, anyone with an interest has a blog page. Even I have a blog page. I haven't updated it in 8 months, but I have a blog page. It's interesting. With print media on the wane, I think that the internet is more and more becoming important. I write less now for our publication than I do for our website. I write news and stories for our website, which gets 1 million hits a week. And so that gives me much more visibility. I like that. And that's better for me.
What do you see kind of down the road for Oregon? What are some things that you're excited about?
Well, I'm excited that people are planting some different things. There's I won't say a fair number, but 4 or 5 producers have Gruner Veltliner planted, and they're pretty good Gruner Veltliners. There's Vermentino in Southern Oregon, and that's a pretty nice Vermentino. Tempranillo has really taken off in the Northwest. You have Tempranillo in Walla Walla, you have Tempranillo in Southern Oregon, and that's doing pretty well. There's some Syrah in the Willamette Valley. Christum has Syrah. David Adelsheim does a very nice Syrah. They're cool climate Syrahs, and they're lovely. I like seeing those different kinds of things going on in the Willamette Valley. But where will Oregon be going? I think this great need to plant more grapes and to have more wineries will slow down. I think the economy will take care of that, and not everyone will survive intact. That's okay. But I think Oregon is pretty well established as making quality wine. I think the perception of Oregon is of quality wine, and that pleases me. That's a nice thing to see.
Do you have sort of a favorite wine now that that you go to in terms of if you're going to have a meal or something like that to celebrate something? Is there something both overall and then something from Oregon that you would go to?
Overall, celebratory for me means an aged wine. So an aged Riesling, an aged Barolo or an aged Burgundy is usually where I go. Oregon, I have a fair number of bottles in my cellar, mostly to show off to other wine writers when they come to Oregon what can happen to Oregon wines as they age, to show them the aging potential of Oregon wines. I usually don't celebrate with Oregon wines. I like drinking them. More and more I like drinking them, but I don't celebrate with them. I'll go to something aged to celebrate.
Washington is also increasing in quality, and
yes.
Do you see sort of a rivalry developing?
Not
between
at all,
yours?
because they're different varieties. Totally different varieties, different climate. It's hot in Washington, in eastern Washington, really hot. And it cools down tremendously at night, and that's what sets the acidity in the grapes, so you get a real ripeness, but with enough acidity to keep it balanced. But they don't grow Pinot Noir, they don't grow Pinot Gris, they do some Riesling. More and more Oregon producers are planting Riesling, so I think that could be a competition. There is, part of the Walla Walla appellation is in Oregon, and some of the better producers make, not only is their facilities in Oregon, but their vineyards are in Oregon. Cayuse, Seven Hills Vineyard, Cataretta has a vineyard there, Zerba. They are all Oregon producers, but they don't ever say that. They call themselves Walla Walla producers, but they're Oregon. Southern Oregon is increasingly producing better wines. Tempranillo is taking a very good hold in the Applegate Valley, and it's really the Applegate Valley that holds a lot of excitement. Cowhorn is a wonderful producer in the Applegate Valley, doing Rhone blends and Rhone varieties, and they do a very good job.
Well, to wrap up, I'd like to ask if you have, first of all, do you have anybody moving into the wine industry? We talk to a lot of people that are just starting out. What would you say to somebody who
Go
says...
slowly, go cautiously. Make sure that your product is the highest quality it can be. Price it fairly, not absurdly, and just go very slowly. It's an industry fraught with dangers all around it. Competition, pricing, distribution, all of these difficult areas. Go slowly. Really take your time to understand what you're really doing.
And what about somebody on the media side of things? Somebody who's aspiring to do what you're doing? What sort of advice would you have for someone?
Start writing for whomever you can start writing for, whether it's a free local newspaper, a community newspaper. Get yourself some credentials, get yourself some experience, and take the stories you've written and the publications for whom you've written, take them to the next step of where you want to be. You've got to start somewhere, and you can't start at the top. So start small and work your way up.
Okay. Well, great.